Hello guys and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be looking at one of the first questions you'll probably ever have as a tank player, and that is what race should I pick and how will it complement my particular playstyle. So the way we're going to structure this is we're going to break it down into both Magicka and Stamina playstyles, alongside also considering some tips on how these races make sense in regards to particular classes I have more experience with. Also, as a caveat, I want to add I was scared about terms of use violations, so the graphics I've used for the racials aren't that flashy and are a bit homemade. So let's begin with Stamina, Dragon Knight and Nightblade tanks, and the reason I'm grouping these together is because the top 3 races happen to be the same. So the number 1 spot I have for these tanks is Imperial. From a general standpoint, Imperial immediately emerges as appealing because of the insane 22% raw stat value they give. This is the strongest racial at the moment. Not only that, but max health is excellent, because as a tank we want to ensure we have about 30k plus, and anything that can help us get to that point is good because it means we can divert various enchants into more beneficial areas, like extra stamina to boost vigor healing. In addition, the racial benefit to max stamina is just generally good as a tank because it enables us to spend more time with block up rather than potentially factoring in human error when we're trying to restore stamina and we get hit by a heavy attack when block is down. So at this juncture, let's apply what we've already talked about to Dragon Knights in particular. I think the best ability that showcases the strength of Imperial racials is Igneous Shields. Now this ability scales off max HP and also has an interaction with max stamina. As we increase our max HP, the damage shield Igneous Shields provides will increase. Not only ourselves becoming more tankier, but also our group, which allows for this, in a sense, become a stronger group utility ability, as it will stop our DPS or healers from dying to AoE effects that often trial fights or some group dungeons have. Now also remember that because we're increasing our max stamina, the Earthenheart passive, which states that when you use an Earthenheart ability you're going to restore 5% max stamina, means that Igneous Shield is going to be restoring your stamina at a much higher rate, which then allows us to spend less time dropping block and restoring stamina, and more time spent on adding buffs to the group, such as Vigor or Igneous Shields. Before turning to Stamina Nightblades, let's look at the final passive that Imperials have, which is Red Diamond. Now this provides a pretty nice heal based on melee attacks, but I don't think this is that strong on Dragon Knights because they're not actually doing that many to make it a reliable heal. This makes the passive the lowest quality of the bunch, and it's certainly not the reason that we're actually picking Imperial to begin with. So now let's move on to our Nightblades. Now the general benefits that Imperials offer to tanking that I've already discussed strongly applies to Nightblades, but one of the most interesting things I want to draw attention to is the interaction of Red Diamond with a particular technique that I recommend you learn as a Nightblade tank. Now if you haven't already seen my other buff management tanking tips video and my section on Nightblades, I recommend you do so. But a short version of it is basically that we do a technique which involves light animation cancelling to restore our resources. This is done by light attacking followed by blocking instantly, to reduce the duration it takes to complete a light attack successfully. This means the amount of melee attacks we're going to be doing as a tank is increased dramatically, especially because we're never really going to heavy attack as a Nightblade tank. Consequently, suddenly Imperial becomes much more attractive because we're using all of the racials rather than kind of consigning one Red Diamond to oblivion, so to speak, in the case of Dragon Knights, as it's not too useful. Let's now move on to talking about the number 2 and number 3 race for both of these tanks. I just want to preface this by saying that I myself believe the resource management of both of these tanks is so strong that it actually changes the ordering of how I would normally rate stamina tanking races. So, my number 2 pick is Nord, and let's just briefly go through it. So once again, the raw stats it provides is great. Extra stamina and extra HP are really strong for tanks. The damage reduction racial is also quite useful and has been unfairly underrated I think in the past by some players, as it can be compared quite easily to things like healing received that Argonians have. In general terms, this passive is great because obviously it makes it a bit more tankier, and as a tank that's probably what we're aiming for if we're doing it correctly, and also allows for our healers to spend less time worrying about us and more time spent actually keeping a group alive or providing extra group buffs. I haven't really touched on the cold resistances or the health recovery racials, but suffice to say that the health recovery will provide a nice minor heal to make you a little bit tankier, and the cold resistances, well in my experience, you probably won't get too much benefit from that. Now because I do recommend using Vampire on most of my tanks because of the free Magicka recovery, which allows us to get off more spells like Igneous Shields, this does mean that the value of the health recovery buff that the Nord racial gives us will decrease, as obviously Vampire has negative impacts on that area. With regards to how Nord is specifically useful for both Dragon Knights and Nightblade tanks, the same really applies to what I talked about when we discussed Imperial. Finally, let's talk about the third race that I've picked out for both of these tanks, and that is Argonian. I want to spend a little bit of time before talking about specifics, just comparing them to Nord, as there is a little bit of controversy or difference of opinion over what is stronger at the moment. So, first off, I think the 12% extra stats you get when using a pot is actually not as great on these tanks, as we have Siphoning Strikes and great abilities within the Dragon Knight tree, such as Resource Regain when using an ultimate, and the Earthenheart passives, which mean that actually our resources are often at a high level. This means that I think that personally it's a little bit of a selfish passive to go for, and that other races can provide more benefits such as a stronger HP buff or stamina buff. Now naturally when compared to Nord, the HP buffs of Argonian and Nord are both the same, so we can cancel those out for sake of comparison. With respect to the Magicka racial, I do not believe it's that strong, especially when compared to Nord, because while it may allow us to cast an extra Igneous Shields or a couple more chains, at the end of the day what we do in order to cast many of those is increase our Magicka recovery. When compared to something like having more max stamina, it suddenly becomes quite clear why Nord would be better in this situation, as stamina scales well with the Irvin Heart passive, alongside enabling us to block for longer and have stronger vigor heals, which helps the group out. So from my point of view, the stat advantages that Nord gives puts it ahead of Argonian to begin with. However, at this point you might be quick to say, well, what about the healing received and the healing done that the Argonians get? Surely that means they're going to be healing a bit stronger than if we were to pick a Nord. Now, I've actually tested this, and while it may seem intuitive, this is not actually the case. And it's particularly pointed out and exacerbated in Dragon Knights. Now, the reason that healing done is not going to do so much for you as a Dragon Knight is because we often cast Igneous Shields, and this means it gives us the major mending buff. Now, it's important to remember that any time we're going to be trying to stack healing done, that it's going to be a multiplicative process and won't add up simply, such as, for example, 25% plus 5% will give us 30% healing done. That's not the case, and consequently we're going to run into some diminishing returns, which means that the effectiveness of the passive is roughly reduced to about 4%, which is a marginal difference, but nevertheless still one to be considering. When we look back and consider that Vigor scales well with Stamina, this means that her intuitions might be wrong, and actually Argonian is not going to provide more heals, but in fact the Nord might just pip it at the post, so to speak. As we've already mentioned, the healing received of Argonians is also pretty comparable to the damage reduction Nords have, meaning that this is not a benefit of Argonians either. Consequently, to sum it all up, in my opinion I believe that Argonians aren't actually that good when resource management is not an issue, and for Nightblades and Dragon Knights I really do not think it is if you play it correctly. Thus, that is why it is on number 3 rather than being on number 2. Now, this is not to say that Argonian is not a good tanking race, and I think it is very strong, but I believe that Nord just marginally gets ahead of the matter. And if we're looking at what the best race is, we're really dealing with marginal things, as you need to remember that often the race you pick is not that crucial as a tank, and you can often get around the limitations of maybe a bad ratio, because ultimately tanking is not easily defined by pure numbers, and can sometimes come down to just preference. Before moving on to the Magicka racials, I'm going to very briefly go through both Stamina, Sorcerer, and Templar. Now, because I have less experience with these classes, I am a little bit hesitant to offer too much detailed advice, but from an outlook I will provide you some ideas. Now, naturally, it's no surprise that Imperial is the number 1 once again. And if you want justification, well, maybe just rewind the video a little bit to remind you. Jokes aside though, number 2 I actually place Argonian ahead of Nord, as we've already talked about, because for both Sorcerers and Templars, our resource management is a little bit more difficult, and anything that we can help with getting our stamina back up to a reasonable level is going to help us actually do a better job tanking, and less time worrying about having to heavy attack and not get killed in the process. I also wanted to add that if we're using Essence of Lingering Health, which is a popular option for tanks to run, especially in difficult trials, this means that we're not getting any stats back from our pots, and so adding a little bit extra from the Argonian passives is really nice. However, I myself use tripots, and as such, from that perspective, even that's great, and so really, no matter what pot you use, Argonian is nice for classes such as these, which struggle with their resource management. Now, number 3 would be Nord, and this is because for all the reasons I've mentioned already. Simply dropping down because it doesn't provide the same level of resource management that I believe is essential for both Templars and Sorcerers. Now, I realise this section was brief and maybe a little bit disappointing for those wanting information on this, but I really do not want to tell you things that I haven't tested out myself and put in-depth research into. Consequently, once I spend more time playing Sorcerer and Templar tanks, I will release a new video in the future with my collected thoughts on that. I mean, it's not all so bad. At least I got a nice festive vacation for you guys, and nothing quite says happy holidays like the defenseless murdering of poor polar bears by people who have just started the game. So, jokes aside, now let's move on to the Magicka discussion. And one of the first problems I actually did run into was that I noticed that often the Magicka racials had an underutilized ratio for tanking in particular, because it's not our job to do damage, and stuff like High Elf, which boosts elemental damage, isn't useful whatsoever, really. This means actually the best races I'm going to recommend are probably not what you're expecting from the get-go when wanting to make a Magicka tank. And, well, unfortunately, and probably no surprise, the number 1 spot is still retained by Imperial, just for that insane 22% extra stats. Now, the reasoning is a little bit different, obviously, in this case, and I noticed on my Breton Magicka Nightblade that all of my gear was often enchanted such that I got more HP or more stamina, and I was actually not investing too much into my Magicka roll. Consequently, this made me think, well, if I was Imperial, I'd surely be able to allocate more into my Magicka, and maybe even my Magicka pool would actually be a little bit greater and increased if I wasn't running Breton and Imperial instead. Naturally, Magicka Nightblades also benefit from Red Diamond because they're doing a similar technique to Stamina Nightblades, or identical actually, in that we're going to be animation cancelling our light attacks. So just to sum Imperial up in a nutshell, the idea is that we have great raw stat increases, which means that we can allocate attributes and enchants into areas we actually want as a Magicka tank, rather than being forced to constantly enchant our gear with health and stamina, which I experienced with my Breton. Let's now move on to number 2, and it's an Argonian. The reason it's Argonian, first off, is because often Magicka tanks have very low stamina pools, and consequently the resource management Argonian provides is quite nice because with that extra bit of stamina increase, it means we have to worry less about our stamina pools and more about having a fun time playing our Magicka builds. Now it seems a little bit silly to say, but the max Magicka ratio that Argonians give is also incredibly useful for Magicka tanks as it boosts the healing we get from Refreshing Path on our Nightblades, or Breath of Life, or Cleansing Ritual on our Templars, in a way that wasn't really the case with stamina builds. The extra healing done and received is also nice because it's going to boost the healing that we often employ as a Magicka tank, and in the case of Templar, which has Major Mending, even though there is diminishing returns, the fact that we're using quite a few healing abilities in comparison to just really Vigor of stamina tanks means that we're still getting a good benefit from it. Finally, the max HP buff that Argonians get is great in a similar vein to Imperial because it allows us to allocate stats elsewhere and spend less time focusing on our health bars. Now, just because I would feel a little bit dirty if I didn't include at least one Magicka race when looking at Magicka tanking, I want to mention Breton and situate it as my third pick. Now, the reason that Breton is strong is because unlike the other Magicka races, it doesn't actually have a ratio which we can't benefit from. Naturally, the max Magicka is nice in that it benefits our heals and also allows us to cast more Magicka abilities. In a similar vein, the Magicka cost reduction is great as it once again allows us to worry less about running out of Magicka and more in just providing extra group heals and ensuring that our group is kept up at a healthy level. Even the spell resistance is still a useful passive, and it's especially the case if you follow my line of tanking, which has infused on the front bar, as I want to ensure that we have the maximum amount of boss reduction, armor and spell resistance wise so as to increase group DPS. Thus, while we're sacrificing our tankiness, this ratio allows us to get back up to a nice level of spell resistance. It also enables us to focus purely on physical resistance in cases where fights are predominantly physical damage. And conversely, if the fight we're in is actually heavy spell damage, it means that we can raise our resistances even further and provide even more tankiness for our group and make the healers worry less about us and more about our allies such as our DPS. Finally, I want to make a special mention to the Dunmer race, and the reason for this, first off, is it is incredibly flexible because of both the max Magicka and max stamina buffs, meaning that you can use it on either a Magicka tank or a stamina tank. If you're a Dragon Knight, being Dunmer is even better, as you can easily spec into one of the best damage dealers in the game at the moment, namely the Magicka DK. This means that you'll have a great flexibility and won't have to worry about creating many new characters if you prefer to just have one or two. Another benefit of Dunmer comes in the form of their flame resistance ratio. And obviously this isn't required, but it will allow you to feel a little bit more comfortable if you go Vampire, which I highly recommend you at least trying out. Finally, as a Dragon Knight tank, if your group has no way of applying engulfing flames other than yourself, the extra flame damage will be a marginal increase, so not really a serious benefit, but I thought I'd at least mention it. So that's about all I have for you today, guys. Now, if you did feel I glossed over certain areas, it probably is the case that I did, and it was just in the interest of keeping this video relatively short and easy to consume. Now, I do hope you guys learned something from this, and if you do want to learn some more about tanking, feel free to check out my other videos on the channel, as they deal with different aspects that obviously I haven't covered in too much detail, or just something that's completely different to the topic of today's discussion. Anyways, as always, thanks for all the support, and hopefully I'll see you guys soon. Bye for now.